There is a museum on Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. Most tourists find it by accident. They come looking for the British Museum, take a wrong turn, and end up standing in a townhouse that belonged to an 18th century architect who spent his life collecting things he didn't fully understand. The building is strange. The rooms are small and dense, every surface covered with antiquities, fragments, casts, and curiosities stacked floor to ceiling. And in the basement, in a low-ceilinged room that visitors often rush through on their way to the upper galleries, there is a sarcophagus. Most people walk right past it. It is made of alabaster so thin that candlelight passes through the stone. It is carved from a single block and covered on every interior surface with hieroglyphs rendered in a deep Egyptian blue. The workmanship is extraordinary. The scale is overwhelming. It is 9 feet long, cut without a seam, and it weighs several tons. The man who commissioned it spared nothing. It was designed to hold a body for eternity. But hidden inside it is something that shouldn't exist. It's empty, not robbed in the way most ancient containers are robbed, not smashed, not pried, not cracked open by desperate hands in the dark. Empty in the way a display cabinet is empty. The interior is pristine. The inscriptions are unbroken. The stone is undamaged. Whatever this sarcophagus was made to hold, either was never placed inside it or was removed so carefully, so completely, that nothing remained. This is the outer sarcophagus of Seti I, pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, one of the most powerful rulers in Egyptian history, father of Ramesses the Great, commander of armies, builder of the great temple at Abydos. When he died, approximately 1279 BCE, his priests prepared what may have been the most elaborate tomb ever constructed in ancient Egypt. They cut it into the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. They painted every centimeter of its walls with texts from the underworld. They oriented the burial chamber to the stars. They built it to last as long as the earth itself. And then the mummy was moved. The sarcophagus was left behind, open, empty, abandoned. And beneath the burial chamber floor, cut into solid rock, there is a passage that descends so deep into the earth that workers who tried to excavate it in 1960 had to stop because the limestone around them began to fracture and shift. When a new team returned in 2007 with steel supports and a rail system for removing debris, they measured the full extent of the passage. 174 meters. That is longer than the main tomb corridor above it. 2 staircases carved at intervals, going deeper and deeper. And then a blank face of uncut rock, an abrupt end. Or so the official record says. If you have never heard of this, that is exactly the point. And if this kind of buried history is what drives you, subscribe right now. We follow every clue wherever it leads, and this one goes somewhere most documentaries won't. Let's start from the beginning, because the details matter, and they have been sitting in plain sight for over 200 years. Giovanni Battista Belzoni was not a gentleman. He was a circus strongman from Padua, 6 feet 7 inches tall, built like something from a different century, who arrived in Egypt in 1815 in the service of the British consul, Henry Salt. His job was to find antiquities and ship them to London. He was extraordinarily good at it. He opened the temple at Abu Simbel. He transported the 7-ton bust of Ramesses II across the desert to a waiting barge. And on October 16, 1817, working in a ravine in the Valley of the Kings with a team of Egyptian workers, he broke through a sealed doorway in a rock face and descended into the longest, deepest, most elaborately decorated royal tomb in the entire necropolis. Catalog designation KV-17. The 17th known tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb of Pharaoh Seti I. Belzoni spent months inside that tomb. He made wax impressions of the wall paintings. He measured corridors, counted steps, documented what he found in journals that still exist, translated from Italian, in several academic libraries. And he described reaching the burial chamber and finding a sarcophagus so extraordinary that he struggled to write about it with any composure. But the mummy was gone. The chamber was stripped of burial goods. The sarcophagus stood open, waiting. Belzoni's employer eventually sold the sarcophagus to the architect Sir John Soane in the 1820s for £2,000, a price the British Museum had refused to pay. It has been in his basement ever since. On display, technically, behind a velvet rope, in a room most visitors move through in under 2 minutes. Here is where things stop being simple. In the floor of the burial chamber, directly beneath the position where the sarcophagus once stood, there is a passage. It descends. Belzoni found it. He described it in his journals as continuing downward into the earth to an unknown distance. This is unusual enough to demand explanation. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings descend on a main axis. They do not typically include a secondary passage plunging beneath the floor of the burial chamber itself, a second downward journey after the first has already ended. That is not a standard architectural feature. That is a deliberate choice. This passage, labeled Corridor K in the modern Egyptological catalog, is not a well shaft. The Valley of the Kings tombs do have well shafts, positioned early in the tomb sequence, designed to catch rainwater and deter robbers. This is different. Corridor K begins beneath the sarcophagus. It cuts downward in stages, and it extends 174 meters, nearly twice the length of the main corridor above it. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic, a ritual connection to the underworld, an architectural metaphor for the solar journey into the primordial deep. Beautiful theology, nothing more. But that explanation has a problem. The Egyptians were extraordinarily literal when they built. When the texts said, "house beneath the mountain," they cut a house beneath a mountain. When the texts said, "corridor of 10,000 years," they built a corridor intended to last 10,000 years. And when the ancient text on the walls of this very burial chamber described something below the burial floor, the priests did not simply paint the description and leave. They dug. So what does the text actually say? The walls of KV 17 contain one of the most complete versions of the Amduat ever found. The Book of What is in the Underworld, a text that functions at its surface level as a religious manual for the pharaoh's journey through the 12 hours of night. Scholars have treated it as cosmological poetry, mythology, pure symbol. But look at how it is actually written. The Amduat does not read like a prayer. It reads like a report. It specifies chambers in sequence. It numbers hours as if timing a process. It names the guardians of each gate with precise functional titles. Not Spirit of Chaos, but Watcher of the 17th Register, Keeper of the Threshold between the 6th and 7th hours. These are administrative designations. They describe an organization, a procedure, a structure. In the lower registers of the Amduat, on the walls of KV 17, there are 3 passages that have been cataloged, translated, and filed under religious symbolism for 2 centuries. Let's look at them the other way. Here is the first clue. The text describes the hidden cavern below the resting place, where the nun renews itself within the stone. Standard translation. The nun is the primordial ocean of chaos, the pre-creation void from which the world emerged. A cosmological reference, nothing physical. But that explanation has a problem. The limestone plateau of the Valley of the Kings sits atop a fractured aquifer system. The Theban Massif, the rock into which every tomb in this valley was cut, contains water-bearing strata at significant depth. In 1999, a geological assessment of the KV tomb complex documented subsurface water channels running beneath several tombs in the Western Valley, fed by the deep fractures in the Theban limestone. The water is real. The noon beneath the burial chamber is not exclusively a metaphor, and a passage that descends 174 meters into limestone beneath a chamber already 30 meters below the surface is a passage that is going toward something or looking for something. The Amduat says there is water below. There is water below. Not similar to what the text describes, not inspired by the idea. The water is there. They weren't guessing. They were recording. Here is the second clue. The lower registers of the Amduat from KV-17 describe the place sealed within the sealed place, where the form of what was before rests upon the stone of the first time. This phrase has resisted comfortable translation for over a century. The mainstream reading: a poetic evocation of the primordial mound, the first solid earth to emerge from the waters of creation. Religious, cosmological, abstract situation. A room within a room, a contained space inside an already contained space. And the word translated as form, shep, appears in non-religious New Kingdom records referring to a physical container, a chest, a sealed repository, something that holds something else. Not similar to a description of a sealed container inside a secondary chamber beneath the burial room. Not inspired by that concept. The same words, the same grammatical construction, the same vocabulary used in the same period to describe the same physical situation. A sealed container inside a secondary sealed space, below the main burial, below Corridor K, below the 174-meter passage, below where the sarcophagus stood, open and empty, the day Belzoni walked in. Here is the third clue. The Amduat text contains a phrase translated as the serpent who guards the mouth of the deep. Every translator from the 19th century forward has read this as a reference to Apophis, the chaos serpent, the eternal adversary of the sun god. Standard mythology, familiar iconography. But Belzoni's journals describe something at the entrance to the lower passage. He renders it, translated from Italian, as a relief panel carved into the floor threshold, depicting a serpent with its mouth open wide. He sketched it. The sketch is held in the Civic Museum of Padua, among other Belzoni documents. When subsequent expeditions entered KV-17 in the decades after 1817, the panel was either buried under debris or passed over without comment. Later accounts do not confirm it. They do not deny it either. A serpent panel at the mouth of the passage, described in the text on the walls above as the marker for the entrance to the deep. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared from the official record. Here is where modern fieldwork enters this story. The 2007 to 2010 excavation of Corridor K by the Supreme Council of Antiquities was the most systematic investigation of the lower passage since Belzoni's workers first cleared debris from it nearly 2 centuries. Earlier, the team was serious. They installed steel support structures to stabilize the compromised rock. They laid a rail system for removing fill material. They mapped the passage in detail. The total length of Corridor K, 174 meters. 2 staircases cut at intervals, suggesting the passage was designed to descend in stages toward a specific level. The rock quality in the deeper sections is described in the excavation notes as poor, friable limestone, prone to sudden collapse. And then the passage ends. The excavation summary uses the word termination to describe the final point. Not sealed, not collapsed, not walled. Termination. But here is what demands an answer. Why cut 2 staircases into 174 meters of rock that leads to nothing? Staircases are not decorative. In Egyptian architecture, a staircase is a functional element, a transition between one level and another. You do not carve 2 staircases into solid limestone at great expense and effort if your destination is a blank wall. You carve staircases if you are going somewhere. The published excavation record from the 2007 to 2010 clearance of Corridor K is approximately 4 pages. For a project that removed the debris from a passage longer than a city block, cut during the reign of one of the most resourced pharaohs in Egyptian history. 4 pages is an extraordinary absence of information. What was in the debris? What objects were recovered? What did the walls of the lower passage contain? What was found or not found at the base of the second staircase? The excavation summary does not say. The tomb of Seti I was formally closed to the public in 2016. The stated reason is accurate and important: structural deterioration. Decades of tourist visitation had introduced humidity levels actively destroying the painted walls. Some of the finest ancient artwork in existence. The Getty Conservation Institute partnered with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities on a long-term stabilization program. This work is real and it matters. But in the published conservation scope, the documentation of what the Getty Egyptian Project intends to address and how, Corridor K does not appear. The lower passage is not listed as a conservation target. It is not listed as an area of investigation. It is not mentioned at all. A structural engineer who worked on the exterior survey of the tomb and who declined to be named told an independent journalist in 2022 that when she raised the subject of the lower passage with the project director, she was told it was deferred to a future phase. The future phase has not been scheduled. It has not been announced. The tomb is sealed. The passage is deferred. The excavation summary runs to 4 pages, and the sarcophagus sits in a basement in London. Now, I want to be precise about something here, because this is the point in the story where it becomes tempting to reach for the most extreme version. Does this prove there is a sealed chamber beneath the burial chamber of Seti I containing something that would rewrite Egyptian history? Probably not. The most dramatic version of this story is built on what is absent, on gaps in the excavation record, on sparse documentation, on a passage that officially leads nowhere. The straightforward explanation is that Corridor K was unfinished. Seti I died with his reign still in progress. Work in the lower passage stopped when the king died, as often happened with New Kingdom tombs. The 2 staircases were cut and then abandoned. There was never anything at the bottom. That is the reasonable explanation. That is what most Egyptologists will tell you if you ask. But that doesn't make this discovery ordinary. Not even close. Because the straightforward explanation still requires you to accept a set of coincidences that are uncomfortable sitting next to each other. The text on the walls above Corridor K describes, in language that matches physical architectural features, a hidden passage below the burial room, water below the passage, and a sealed container in a secondary sealed space below that. The passage exists. The water is there. The serpent panel that marks the entrance in the text was sketched by the first person to enter the tomb. And the passage is 174 meters long, with 2 functioning staircases, an investment of labor and stone that does not describe an abandoned afterthought. The mummy was moved in antiquity. The priests of Amun, during the 3rd Intermediate Period, roughly around 1000 BCE, organized the collection of royal mummies from across the Valley of the Kings and relocated them to a concealed shaft tomb at Deir el-Bahri, DB 320. They did this to protect the pharaohs from an escalating crisis of tomb robbery. The relocation was enormous. 52 royal mummies moved in secret, rewrapped, relabeled in ink on their linen, and stacked in a corridor with the care of people who were running out of time. In the 1870s, a family of tomb robbers from the village of Kurna, the Abd el-Rasul family, found the entrance to DB 320. They descended the shaft and emerged into a corridor lined with the bodies of kings. They had been selling artifacts from the cache for nearly a decade before Egyptian authorities caught on and broke the operation in 1881. When the official team finally descended into DB 320 that year, they found the greatest archaeological discovery Egypt had ever produced: Ahmose I, Tutmose III, Ramses the Great, stacked in the dark like furniture in an attic. Seti I was among them. His mummy is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. His face is recognizable. His expression is still serene. But something was not moved with him. Something stayed behind. When the ancient priests gathered the royal mummies and brought them to DB 320, They took the bodies, they took certain grave goods, but there is no record, no inventory, no indication in any of the administrative documents that accompanied the relocated mummies of anyone entering Corridor K. No record of anyone descending those staircases. No record of anything being removed from the lower passage. Either they couldn't, or they didn't, or they left whatever was down there exactly where it was, deliberately, knowing that the safest place for it was at the bottom of 174 meters of deteriorating limestone in a tomb, sealed shut and buried under the rubble of centuries. The passage is still there. The second staircase still ends at a face of rock that an excavation team walked away from in 2010 and never returned to. The serpent panel that Belzoni sketched in 1817 has not been located, confirmed, or recovered by any expedition since. The debris that was cleared from Corridor K between 2007 and 2010 has not been publicly cataloged. The sarcophagus, built to hold the body of Seti I for eternity, stands in a basement in London, its walls inscribed with a complete account of where the passage goes, what it passes through, and what waits at the end. The Amduat text is right there, written in blue pigment on alabaster stone, translated and filed, and categorized as cosmological poetry. It is still in the basement, behind the velvet rope, in the room that tourists walk through on their way to something else. And the passage is still going down. 174 meters. 2 staircases, Corridor K, beneath the burial chamber of the greatest royal tomb ever cut in Egypt. Officially deferred. Structurally compromised. Sealed from the surface by the rock of the Theban Massif and by the conservation order that has kept the doors of KV-17 locked since 2016. The tomb robbers who found that passage in 1817 came for gold. They found an empty chamber and a hole in the floor that went somewhere they couldn't follow. They were the first people in centuries to stand at that entrance, and they didn't go in. Whatever stopped them, whether it was the shifting rock, the sounds that Belzoni described hearing from below, or something else entirely, they turned back. Whatever is at the bottom of those stairs has been waiting ever since. If this kind of hidden history is what drives you, hit the like button, leave a comment with what you think Corridor K was built to reach, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The Valley of the Kings is not finished giving up its answers, and neither are we.